With Carver's group dead, the group members were scrambling to help the injured and members nursing station. Carlos picked up Shell with Becca close behind him. It had seemed that she wanted to be at her sister's side. Wyatt held Alvin over by a nearby chair so Carlos could look at his leg while Serena went over to the other chair. She would grip her shoulder and cringe from the pain, in the similar fashion that Alvin did with his injured leg. Carlos said to Shell, and sat later on one of the beds and started to treat her wounds. After a while, he said, "All right, Becca, make sure that your sister's still breathing. Watch her chest. If it stops, you yell for me." Okay," Becca said. She seemed nervous and scared. She didn't want to lose her sister. Carlos ran over to Alvin next. He examined the bullet wound and he asked, "How are you feeling?" "It hurts like hell," Alvin said as he huffed. Carlos took off his backpack and got ready to apply some disinfectant to the wound. "Ready?" Carlos asked. Alvin shook his head in response and readied himself as the searing pain. Carlos applied the disinfectant that made Alvin jolt in pain. "Ah!" Alvin exclaimed. "Shit!" Carlos proceeded to wrap the bandages around his wound. Sarah walked over to Serena and said, "I'm not as experienced as my dad, but maybe I can help you." Serena smiled and said, "I would appreciate that, sweetie." Serena took off her hooded sweatshirt and pulled it her sleeve up to reveal the scarred skin where the bullet had managed to graze her. Sarah exclaimed and the wound and said, "It's not too terrible, but we'll need something to bring the swelling down, and we'll probably need to bandage it." "Okay," Serena said. Zeke looked back upon hearing some footsteps. His eyes widened when he saw Luke, Matthew, and a young boy around Clem's age approaching the group. Two men were beaten in addition, Luke was bleeding from his abdomen. It didn't look serious, but it looked almost unnoticeable since he was carrying Clementine in his arms. He turned to his head and looked over Rebecca, gasped, "Luke, Matthew, oh my gosh, my poor baby. Is she all right?" Rebecca ran over to Luke, who was carrying Clementine. The young girl had specks of blood all over her and her clothes, plus her hands were covered in blood. "She's all right. She's just exhausted," Luke said. "What happened?" Rebecca asked. "It was a trap. Carver knew we were going to escape from the get-go," Matthew said. "We just played at him in his own game," Alvin muttered. "Without Jean, we would have been done for," Mike said. Luke huffed as he carried Clementine to the other bed, which was next to Shell. Things weren't much better in Alv Carver's office. He used Clem as a human shield. She fought back and got away from him, Luke said. It all went down to a fist fight from there. If it hadn't been for Clem, I'm not sure if we would have survived. He then turned to Rebecca and said, "I need to talk to you alone. Can you hand off Genevieve to someone else?" "Of course," Rebecca said. She went over to Zeke and said, "Can you look after Jen for a few minutes?" "Sure," Zeke said, as he accepted the toddler. "Mama," Genevieve cried, as Rebecca gave the toddler to Zeke. "It's okay, baby girl. Mommy will be right back," Rebecca said to the toddler. Genevieve whined as Rebecca walked over to Luke which turned into crying. Hey, you used to be so good with me looking after you," Zeke said as he bobbed the toddler in his arms. "Are you fussy because you're tired?" Zeke asked. He had the toddler lay her head on his shoulder and continued to bob her and started to rub her back in comfort. It wasn't long until the crying turned into whimpering, which soon became nothing. He knew that she was asleep. "You're good at that," the young boy said. Zeke chuckled and said, "It just takes some practice. It comes pretty naturally. I'm Zeke." "I'm Gil. It's nice to meet someone normal for once," Gil said. Zeke scoffed and said, "I'm normal? You're not attacking me. I consider that normal," Gil said. Their conversation was cut short when they heard someone crying out. They looked over to see Sarita crying into Matthew's chest as he did his best to comfort her. However, tears were flowing from his eyes. "Kenny didn't make it, did he?" Zeke asked as he turned to Gil. It didn't take him long to connect the dots. He had depressed looks that were seen on Matthew's and Luke's faces. Plus, Kenny was nowhere to be seen. Gil nodded and he said, "He died a hero. Clementine didn't take it too. It was very scary. She got Luke's machete and I've never seen so much blood." You don't have to explain any further, Zeke said. Are you okay? Gil nodded and he said, I just want to find my parents. They're still out there somewhere looking for me. We'll find them, don't worry, Zeke said. Thanks, Gil said as a smile formed on his face. Zeke looked back to Clementine with a worried look. He had somewhat of an idea of what happened from Gil's expression, but he'll need to get the whole story from Luke. You could tell that Gil was too traumatized by what he saw. Zeke could hear footsteps approaching from behind him. He looked back to see Jane running past him to address the group. Looks like our luck isn't going to hold. Remember that huge herd that Carver was talking about in the yard? Well, it heard us and now the herd's getting ready to slam into this place. The group members looked in shock. They looked too concerned before looking to Jane. What are we gonna do? Luke asked. Can we fight them off? Not a chance. The herd is too big. We need to leave. But first, we're gonna have to cover ourselves, Jane said. Cover ourselves? What the hell does that mean? Mike asked. We have to kill a couple of walkers to cover themselves in the entrails. It will keep them from attacking us, Jane explained. That's fucking crazy. That won't work, Mike said as he walked up to Jane. No, she's right. That's how Clem got through Savannah, with her guardian covered her and she got through. The whole city was completely overran. Tavia told me that you could barely walk through the streets, Luke explained. I could vouch for that as well. I have pulled that move a couple times myself, Zeke said. And what happened to her guardian? Mike asked. He was already bit, and he wasn't going to make it regardless of what happened, Luke said. Look, if you don't want to live, fine, whatever. You could stay here and get eaten. For anyone who doesn't want to be eaten, Jane said as she was interrupted by a loud crunching sound. Shit, Jane said before ran over the source of the crunching sound. Luke and Russell followed behind her. Rebecca looked over to Zeke and said, I'm glad you haven't lost your touch. Mind if I take her back? I don't mind, Zeke said. Rebecca picked up the toddler from Zeke's grasp. She didn't move an inch. She must have been very tired. The group members waited for the three to return. Zeke then looked around and could tell the adults seemed anxious. Sarah joined Zeke and said, I can't believe all this happened. Yeah, we got really lucky, and we have more casualties, Zeke said as he pondered on how he and his group outmanned and outgunned. Do you always look on the bright side? Sarah joked. Zeke scoffed. I guess you do got a point. We did make it. I guess we just need to worry about the herd outside, Zeke said. Sarah nodded. Something must have caught her eye. When she looked past them with wide eyes and her mouth wide open, Zeke turned to see what she was looking at. Jane, Luke, Sarah, and Russell were all back, but carrying a couple of dead walkers with them. Jane threw the corpses that she was carrying onto the ground and huffled as Luke and Russell did the same. We need to hurry. The loud crash was smashing down one of the garage doors. They're getting in as we speak. She got on her knees and slashed one of the walkers open and started to cover herself in the entrails. Sarah, come, I'll cover you, Carlos said, as he walked up to another corpse. Sarah walked over to her dad and got covered. One by one, the group members started to cover themselves as well. Rebecca made sure to cover Shell and Clementine, since they were both unconscious. Here, Jane said, as he kicked the walker that used to cover herself and Luke to Zeke and Gil. Cover each other. Zeke crouched down and started to cover himself with the entrails. Oddly enough, it didn't feel weird for him. You could tell that most of the adults were disgusted when they were gutting and putting the entrails on. He was used to gutting animals from his youth. However, he wasn't used to smearing the entrails on himself. The smell was far worse than any other animal that he's ever skinned. Do we have to do this? It's really gross, Gil said. I know, but it's only our ticket out of here. Come on, I'm covering you next, Zeke said as he finished covering himself in the entrails. Gil was hesitant, but obliged when whined in disgust as Zeke covered him. I'll get your back, Luke said, as he walked over to Zeke. He started to cover Zeke's back with the entrails. Okay, that would work, Zeke said. Turn around, I'm going to get your back. Gil nodded and turned around. Zeke covered him with the entrails as he was for sure that the walkers wouldn't notice him too much. Hurry up, here they come, Jane said. Zeke stood up and saw several walkers limping towards the hardware store. All right, how do we do this? Luke asked. You just walk through and don't panic, Zeke said. Exactly, Jane said. All right, if we get separated, we meet up at Parker's Run, right? Luke said. Carlos and I know the way. Plus, there are signs all over this place. Come on, said Jane, as she walked over towards the door where the walkers were starting to come in. The group members followed behind her, with Mike carrying Shell and Wyatt carrying Clementine. Zeke figured that Alvin was too injured to carry her. The walkers were feasting on the corpses of Carver's men, and now that the gunfire had died down, they must have been attracted to the corpses. The group maneuvered their way through the garage, getting into house so they could use a different garage door to get out. Aside from a few snarls and growls, the group went unnoticed. Jane and Russell opened the garage door as quiet as they could. They could have only had a few seconds to get out of house before the herd would notice the new opening. Jane was the first one to hop down and signal everyone else to follow. So far, everything was working out. They proceeded into the herd as they saw the way in its new opening. The numbers of the herd soon started to separate from the group members from each other. They were scattered amongst the herd. Jane? Carlos asked as he looked around. Zeke could hear Sarah's heavy breathing. She was starting to panic. More likely her anxiety was getting the best of her. Carlos hushed his daughter, but it was no use. She was looking in every direction. She was going slower and slower until she finally came to a stop. Sarah, we have to keep moving, Carlos said as he turned back to her. Hey, come on, it's all right, Zeke said as he nudged her forward. Suddenly a loud scream was heard, and it sounded like someone was dying. Sarah gasped at the scream. Zeke looked to the source of the screaming just to hear gunshots. Wasn't sure who it was, but it sounded like one of the adults. Sarah started to hyperventilate, which got the attention of the nearby walkers. Sarah, look at me, Carlos said. Everything will... He was interrupted mid-sentence when a walker bit down his neck. He screamed in agony as the creature tore off most of his neck. Dad! Sarah screamed. Zeke then looked around and pulled his knife. He didn't have a chance to reload his gun. He noticed several walkers limping over to Carlos and started feasting on his body. Meanwhile, Sarah just whimpered and continued to hyperventilate. Zeke noticed this at the walkers and was more preoccupied by eating Carlos than the whimpering teen next to them. He didn't know what would last very long. Zeke grabbed Sarah by her shoulders so that she was looking at him only. Sarah, I know it's hard, but you need to stay calm, Zeke said. Sarah continued to breathe heavily until she finally said, I can't. I need my daddy. Her shouts drew some of the walkers towards them. Zeke looked around. There was only one thing he could think of. Sarah wasn't able to move. Fear, panic, grief paralyzed her in one movement. Zeke had managed to pick her up and ran as fast as he could away from the approaching walkers. He was lucky that Sarah was so light and wasn't struggling within his grasp. He was also fortunate that he was taller than her. Otherwise, carrying her would have been more difficult. He huffed as he continued to carry the girl. She may have been light, but she was still a 15-year-old girl. He could hear the walkers earlier still chasing them. He looked up to see the edge of the forest. He was close. He had to push himself just a bit more. He huffed as he got closer and closer to the edge of the forest. He could still hear the growls getting closer, and they were gaining on them and Sarah. He almost threw the herd something from behind him knocked him down. He groaned upon hitting the ground. He got his arms up in a way to protect him from the walker. He looked over to see the other walkers approaching Sarah, who was in no condition to move or help him. She looked up and saw the walkers approaching her. This was enough to make her jump to the feet. She stumbled away from the undead creatures before tripping back to the ground. No, 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 no! Sarah screamed as she crawled back from the walkers. She finally got up to her feet and avoided the approaching walkers. She looked at Zeke with wide eyes before ducking under the walker's swinging arm. But she was cut off by another walker. Just go! Run! Zeke exclaimed as he fought back the walker that was on top of him. He knew that she was going to die getting him to run. Run! Zeke shouted at the girl. And with that, the girl turned and ran from the approaching walkers that were now more interested in Zeke. He was too exhausted to bring out his knife to stab the creature that was on top of him. While keeping it from eating him, its gashing teeth got closer to his neck. The other walkers were getting closer. However, something unexpected happened. A knife was protruded from the walker's skull. It made it completely lifeless. The knife was pulled out and the creature's body was thrown off. He huffed when he saw Jane. She looked around the other walkers and proceeded to kill several of its creatures with her knife. Zeke huffed as he got up from the ground. Thanks, Zeke said, between huffs. We'll talk later, Jane said. As she pulled her knife from the walker's skull, the creatures continued to limp forward towards her and Zeke. There were so many. Come on! She made a run for it into the woods. Zeke followed behind her. He nearly got grabbed by a couple of walkers and wasn't so sure if anyone else made it. What's worse than figured that Sarah thought he was dead. After sprinting a few yards, he finally fell to the ground and huffed before throwing up. Exhaustion had finally kicked in, and he rolled onto his back. He looked at the night sky. Shit, he heard Jane said, before he blacked out.